Hello, this is Dr. Tim Harrison, coming to you from the Institute of Advanced Studies in Religion and Philosophy, also known as the room my wife makes me go to when she wants to watch TV by herself. You'll notice that I'm sporting a bit of a black eye today. I had surgery on my left eye, and it was good surgery. I can now see out of my left eye. First time I can really see well out of it in a little over a year, so I was very pleased with it. This week we're looking at the Gospels. We're going to start delving into the actual books of the New Testament, and we're going to start by taking a look at the Gospels. Gospels, of course, are the first four books. Gospel, Godspell, means good news, and the Gospels were written by three gentlemen. The first three are called the Synoptic Gospels. That's Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Matthew is thought to be the disciple Matthew, the tax collector. Mark was a comrade of Peter, and we believe that what Mark is really just the gospel according to Peter. And then there's Luke. Luke is the only Gentile to write a book in the New Testament. Interestingly, his book has been split in two. We know it as the book of the Gospel of Luke and the book of Acts today. But in the beginning it was one volume telling us about the gospel and the history of the early church. And then John. It's thought that John, at least traditional scholars believe that John the disciple wrote the Gospel of John. John is different from the Synoptic Gospels because the Synoptic Gospels synchronize much of their information. John tells different information and has different theological perspectives in what he tells. So that's the four Gospels as we look at it. Now, there are some preconceived notions inside of the Gospels. Some scholars, mostly modern scholars, believe that the books are more theological than they are historical. Traditional scholars believe that they are both. They are historical and theological. So that's a bit of a difference nuance from the two different camps of scholarship. Now, in looking at the Gospel, there are a couple of different ways of actually reading and looking at the Gospels. Most folk read the Gospels as a devotional work or something for inspiration or religious guidance. Some people read it from the standpoint of scholarship or literature. Two ways of looking at it. One, fundamentalist, you hear that term quite often, believe that every passage is inerrant, that it is absolute truth and directly dictated from God. Most scholarship doesn't accept that and realize that there are different points of view within the gospel, and it's not necessarily not inerrant, but not absolutely literal is what fundamentalism tends to take it as absolute literal. And of course, most people realize that if you take it absolutely literal, then you'll have some difficulty because there's parts of the New Testament that are written in hyperbole. For instance, when Jesus said, in order to follow him, you must love him so much that it seems like hate toward your mother and father. Well, that's not Jesus telling us that we have to hate our mother and father in order to follow him. He's just simply saying that our dedication to him is so great. That's what it seems like. It's a hyperbole. There's a song out, a popular song out, that uses hyperbole when it says how far as the east is from the west. That's hyperbole. And we find that in the New Testament a good bit. Now, modern scholars believe there are some discrepancies in the gospel accounts. Traditional scholars said they are not. Those are not discrepancies. They also believe that the gospel uses some pre-existing traditions about Jesus in their stories. They believe that there is a document called the Q document. Q, or Quell in German, means source. And that this was used by the Synoptic Gospels, and that's the reason that they are all synchronized, or the stories are the same. Because again, modern scholarship is skeptical. And so it begins with this skepticism that three Gospels are going to be that close to one another without using a similar source. Of course, traditional scholars say they're simply reporting the same event, and that's why, therefore, it is the same, because it is historical. Keep that in mind. Now, we do know that the Gospels were written a little bit after the death of Jesus. Now, in comparison to other historical writings, it's written pretty quickly. The first incident of Alexander the Great was written much, much later, almost 100 and something years, 150 years I believe it was, after his death that the first stories first came out. The stories of Buddha came 200 or 300 years later. Stories of Jesus came about 25 years later. And so we see that there would be some of the oral history taking place that the Gospels would have used. It's thought that Luke, because he was a Greek and he was very educated, actually used Greek methodology in order to write the Gospel and wrote it like a Greek historian would, and did interviews and other things. So that's quite important. Now, there are different types of ways of looking at this. One is a form criticism that looks at each section. They don't believe that it's a continuation, but rather that these are just sections of stories that are placed in here. And what they believe is that these different stories are parts of either the cue or part of the oral tradition. And form criticism looks at what is known as the Sitzenleben. Sitzenleben. That means the situation of life. What was life like when Jesus was proclaiming this or saying this? What was the culture like? What were the people like? We know that Palestine was very poor, that the people who came to listen to Jesus were mostly poor people, although some Pharisees and lawyers did come as well. And this is part of the Sitzenleben, the story of life at that time. That's important because if you don't consider that, you can take the gospel and try to apply it too neatly to modern day, and it doesn't necessarily apply itself well. For instance, the conditions of divorce and what was a divorce. Men usually were the only ones who could get a divorce. Women could not divorce men. That's a part of the Sitzenleben. And so if you try to look at modern day divorce and try to apply the principles of the New Testament to modern day divorce, it doesn't fit completely without some issue. Now, Mark was sort of the inventor of the gospel genre. He was the first one to write a gospel. It is thought that it was the first one somewhere around 65 CE, CE meaning Christian era. And again, it is believed that Mark is simply writing the story as Peter would tell him. And it's thought that Mark probably used the Q source and maybe some other sources to get this together. Traditional scholars say, oh no, Mark just simply wrote the story as Peter presented it to him. It's a very interesting gospel, and as we get into Mark, we'll see how it differs from the other gospels. Luke also used the Q document, and he copied from Mark, and that's why his stories are very similar. Okay, again, Luke tends to look at the Gospels from a very Gentile point of view, and so that's one of the reasons that people find it interesting that his stories match up. But again, it could be that they're simply telling the story as it happened. If all of us tell the story of Derek Jeter's last game as a Yankee, I bet many of us, at least those of us who watched his last game, would get a similar result. Okay. Now, when we come to the Gospel of John, there are some other issues with the Gospel of John that make it a little different from the other Gospels. So we will take a look at that when we get there. Now, redaction criticism looks at the sources, the source material, and theological purposes. It's believed that each gospel is written with a theological point of view in mind. Now, whether that's true or not, there's certainly theology in there. There's no way of taking that out. But then again, that's exactly what the Gospels were written for as well. Epistles dealt much more into the idea of theology, but certainly Gospels have it as well. Narrative criticism just sort of looks at the way that the story's constructed, looking at the detail of it. Your first video is sort of a narrative criticism from a traditional point of view. And then what we get is sort of a composite story of Jesus. Okay, when you look at all the Gospels, you get this composite story of Jesus. And as I said, traditional scholars will tell you that there's no contradictions in there, that actually it's just different points of view. And as you can imagine, different people are going to give different points of view at times. Even though they may record the events the same, they are going to have different points of view. So that's just a little beginning of the Gospels. We will start looking at the Gospel of Mark next week and start looking at the differences between the Gospels and how each Gospel writer tried to tell their story.